The trade deadline is over, and Alexander Kerer and Juuse Saros are still in a Nashville Predators uniform, but for how long? We'll look at each player's Smashville future, plus a Tuesday plus minus on today's Locked On Predators podcast.
Your Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making the Locked On Predators podcast your first listen of the day every single day. We are your free daily Nashville Predators podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, want to start with a special shout out to our loyal Locked On Pred heads out there, the everydayers who tune into every single show. We love you guys and we appreciate the support you give us week in and week out. I'm Nick Morgan. I'm a writer at Penalty Box Radio. Normally have a partner in crime, Ann Kimmel, but she is off this week. On today's show, a big topic of conversation about the Nashville Predators' future. Juuse Saros not traded at the deadline. That really wasn't a surprise as the weeks went on. Alexander Kerer not traded at the NHL trade deadline. That may be a little bit more of a surprise to Preds fans. What are both of their futures in a Preds uniform? We'll talk about that topic. A special Tuesday edition of Plus Minus, where we talk about leadership and a red-hot Luke Evangelista, and a surprising minus given one of the big Predators storylines over the past month. All of that coming up on today's show. First, I want to mention today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. All right, a big topic of conversation for Preds fans right now is Juuse Saros. The Predators goaltender is playing absolutely great right now. He is a big reason that the Predators have points in 11 consecutive games at this point. So shout out to him. He's starting to look like the Juuse Saros of the past few years, that game-changing player that really helped the Predators get into a contentionship spot, whatever you want to call that. Basically, they were much better than they probably ever should have been with Juuse Saros in net. But the other side of that is that Juuse Saros only has 1 year left on his contract after this year. He is going to be a unrestricted free agent after next season. You have Yaroslav Askarov coming up, and you also had a ton of people around the league calling on the Nashville Predators, basically asking if there was a possibility to maybe get Juuse Saros on their team. Ultimately, we know what happened. Barry Trotz backed off the trade talk. Basically said, we're keeping Juuse Saros unless, somebody absolutely blows us away with an offer. No one did. And yay, Juuse Saros is still on the team. But that does bring up the question, what is Saros' future with the Nashville Predators? Same goes for Alexander Kerer. This was a guy that had been drawing a lot of interest around the league. We heard Vancouver was maybe interested in adding him at the deadline. We heard talk that Toronto also may have been interested. A couple of teams like Vegas, who also apparently were shopping for some defensive depth, especially now that Alec Martinez miraculously got injured after they acquired Tomas Hertl. This was a guy that could have gotten maybe a first-round pick from the right team on the market, maybe a desperate team. Predators decided to keep him, even though he doesn't have a new contract, basically saying, he's kind of our own rental at this point. We see more value in keeping him for a potential playoff run than we do, just giving him for assets, or to help some other team make a cup run. Makes sense, but it gives us I guess it just gives us pause to ask, what is the Predators' future for both of these players? Let's talk about Juuse Saros, because that's the big one. Obviously, goaltending is a weird thing in the NHL. You know, it's hard to find a player like Juuse Saros who's just been so consistently good in each of the past few seasons. There are very few goaltenders that you can really say that about. Connor Hellebuyck is another one. You talk about Igor Shesterkin, you talk about Ilya Sorokin, just those game-changing goaltenders who put up just 920 save percentage year after year after year after year. Juuse Saros is one of those guys, and it's very rare to find someone like that. So this is a franchise goalie that a lot of teams around the NHL, I think, would give their left legs for. I mean, look at, what Toronto is doing right now and their uncertainty in goal really kind of maybe holding them back a little bit. You talk about the Edmonton Oilers, one of the most skilled forward cores in the history of the NHL, outdone in the playoffs in each of the past handful of seasons because of goaltending issues. Teams crave a player like Juuse Saros. And I think the Nashville Predators have to be aware of that. And I think that is absolutely why Barry Trotz's asking price was so monumentally high. I said this before. You shouldn't trade Juuse Saros just for the sake of trading Juuse Saros, just for the sake of, we need to tank this and that whatsoever. Juuse Saros has been the best player on your team for probably 4 straight seasons at this point. You have to treat him as you would any sort of other franchise player on the market. The return you have to get is a return that is going to jumpstart something for your franchise moving forward. For the Nashville Predators' sake, it's probably a forward that you would consider the number 1 scorer, or the go-to guy, preferably a number 1 young center. Either that or maybe, a dynamic winger capable of scoring 40, 45, 50 goals per year. There's got to be somebody like that in that package. And it just didn't seem like at the deadline anybody was really willing to make that move right now. And I think that's what this deadline boiled down to. But here's the other end of that spectrum for Juuse Saros. He does have 1 more year left on his contract. You do have Yaroslav Askarov coming up in the system. Now, I know Askarov is not tested at the NHL level. He is only a prospect, and that's fine. But sooner or later, you got to figure out if he is sort of the franchise goalie of the future that you envision him being. And at the same time, if he's not, or you don't trust it, then you have to figure out, do we invest in Juuse Saros? Because he's got 1 year left after this on a $5 million deal. That's pretty good for the way he's playing. He's going to be 29 years old when his contract expires and he hits unrestricted free agency. If you're the Nashville Predators and there's a little bit of cap hell coming out the year that he is he's going to hit the market, there's going to be about $9 million in dead cap space. If you're the Nashville Predators, do you feel confident about the direction of your team that you're willing to go out and spend maybe $9 million a year on a Juuse Saros to lock him up? Are you that close to the Stanley Cup? Do you think that he is the missing piece? And do you think he's going to be consistent for, the 7-8 years that deal is going to be in place? That's actually, going to be a tough sort of debate that Barry Trotz and Andrew Brunette are going to have with each other when they have these discussions. Or else maybe the unthinkable happens. Maybe Juuse Saros does get traded next year. And look, we know Barry Trotz was kind of non-committal after the deadline. When he was asked about Juuse Saros and the possibility of trade, he said, look, I'm leaving nothing off the table right now. Like, there's a strong possibility that we could pick this back up again in, a couple of months when the season ends. We could revisit things. And I think that may be the best course for the Nashville Predators, to pick up things in the offseason and see what offers you can get for him. because once the offseason hits, you're going to have some teams maybe be more aggressive in looking for a goaltender. A team like Toronto is not going to want to mess with too much chemistry right now. They're not going to want to ship prospects out. They're not going to want to ship young players who are playing, in the middle of this playoff push to get a goaltender. They're not going to want to do any sort of salary cap microscope work or anything like that. But maybe they're willing to do that in the offseason. Maybe the Edmonton Oilers are willing to finagle some salary this offseason to maybe make a move and take a big swing at a goaltender. Same thing for a team like LA, who didn't really want to spend a lot during the offseason, or a team like New Jersey, who wanted to kind of stay in the playoff race with some of the young players they had. So if you had to ask me, I would say this is kind of where we're headed for right now. I think that we are not going to hear anything on the Juuse Saros front. I think he is going to finish the season with the Nashville Predators. And I think when we get to the offseason, you're going to start to hear the trade chatter around Juuse Saros kick up again. And at that point, I think this summer, if Juuse Saros is ever going to get traded, it is going to be this summer. And I think we are going to see a team maybe step up and make a big deal for the Predators franchise goaltender. We'll have to see. If not, there's two situations where maybe that doesn't happen. One is that maybe we get to the summer and nobody is really willing to take a swing on a big goalie. We've seen that before around the NHL. Remember, Connor Hellebuck, before he signed his extension, was on the block earlier this year. And because of the Bobrovsky contract, because of the Korpisalo drama, there's a lot of teams sort of iffy on spending big for a goalie. I think everybody still has the Ryan Miller trade deadline PTSD from what feels like 10 years ago at this point. Maybe a team doesn't really want to give up that big package to get Juuse Saros on their roster. And at that point, if you're the Nashville Predators, then maybe you sit and say, okay, well, it's more value for us just to have him on our team at this point and have him help us try to win moving forward. And hey, if we bring up Yaroslav Askarov and he is as good as advertised, then hey, for the rest of this year, we got two pretty good franchise goalies. Or the other thing that could happen is maybe the Predators make a playoff push this year. I mean, stranger things can happen. They're in the conversation, let's not forget. And if that happens, maybe the Nashville Predators feel like, okay, we're close. Now we can go out and sign Juuse Saros to that big extension because we think he is our franchise goaltender. Like I said, this summer, both the playoffs and the offseason is going to be a franchise-changing one for the Nashville Predators, and it is going to be fascinating to see what Barry Trotz and Andy Burnett do. The other person to consider in this is Alexander Kerer, a guy that a lot of people thought was going to be traded at the deadline. He was not. Predators treating him as quote-unquote their own rental. Does he have a chance to be back in Nashville next season, or are the Preds content with letting him hit free agency? We'll talk about that, plus some plus-minus coming up here in just a little bit. First, I want to mention today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. We are officially hitting the stretch run of the NHL season. Regardless of whether the Preds make the playoffs, miss the playoffs, go into buy mode, sell mode this summer, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether studs like Ryan O'Reilly, Philip Forsberg, Roman Josi, Connor McDavid, Nathan McKinnon, Sidney Crosby, and more will record more or less than their Sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. For instance, McDavid is going to have Over under 0.5 goals in his next game. Will Roman Josi have more or less than 2.5 shots on goal his next game? If you can nail 8 of those player stat bets, you win 100 times your money on Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. All right, coming up later this week, we have some Preds talk. They take on the Winnipeg Jets tomorrow. That is going to be an absolutely banger of a game. We will have a preview of that game, plus recap coming up later this week, and some Milwaukee Admirals and Preds prospect talk. So stay tuned for that later this week. Before that, though, I want to talk about Alexander Kerer and his future with the Nashville Predators. Remember, this was a guy that a lot of people thought was absolutely going to be traded this trade deadline. In fact, I think it was maybe either Frank Cervelli or Elliot Friedman, one of the guys that said, yeah, that's Alexander Kerer is almost the one guarantee to leave Nashville at this point. It didn't happen. Barry Trotz said he, based on the deals, would rather use Kerer on the team, have him as their own rental. And then, whatever happens in the offseason happens. It sounds like the two sides are still talking about a contract, even though they seem pretty far apart at this point. Kerer making $2.5 million this year. He is going to get a big raise by whatever team. If he hits the open market, wouldn't be surprised to see maybe $4.5, $5 million on a multi-year deal from a team. He's a 27-year-old right shot defenseman. Those are rare in the NHL nowadays. And he's somebody who can contribute on the penalty kill. He has had some history playing on the penalty kill, or on the power play, excuse me. So he is a versatile player, and I think a lot of teams are going to covet him. If you're the Nashville Predators, do you go out and sign Alexander Kerer? You already signed Dante Fabro, and I think that was maybe sort of the clue as to how this is going to play out. Because, God, it just always has seemed like for years now that it was going to either be one or the other. It just seemed like Kerer and Fabro, their destinies were sort of intertwined in Nashville. And with Fabro coming back on a one-year deal, and Kerer, pending free agent, the Predators have some people on the team that they kind of want to emphasize instead. It just doesn't seem like this is going to end with Dante Fabro staying in Nashville long term. And if that's the case, then maybe you do look at this deadline as a little bit of a fail for not trading Alexander Kerer. I would imagine it is going to take a team maybe somewhere between, I don't know, if I think the Nashville Predators could get away with maybe $3.5 to $4 million a year for Alexander Kerer. He's probably going to want some term. So if you're a Nashville Predators fan, are you good with Kerer coming back on, let's say, $3.5, $4 million a year for 4 years, maybe 3 years? Yeah, that's a tough question because you do have players like Spencer Stastny coming up who the Predators are actively trying to get more ice time for. They kind of blew it this year with something that we're going to talk about coming up in plus minus. If you're going to ask me, if you had to put a gun to my head and ask me what Kerer's future is, I think that this is kind of his last hurrah in Smashville. And if it is, great story, great player. And, the Nashville Predators are certainly going to miss a player of his caliber. Of course, I'm saying this now on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday, he'll be locked up to a new long-term extension for the Nashville Predators. So stay tuned for that. Let's move on to Plus Minus, a special Tuesday edition of Plus Minus. You guys know how this works. Every week, we look at the past week of Nashville Predators hockey. We go through things we like. We give them a plus. We go through things that could be improved or things we don't like, and we give them a minus. I'm going to start off with a big plus from really the past handful of games, and that is a co-plus to Roman Yosi and Filip Forsberg, the two leaders, the two longtime leaders of the Nashville Predators. They're the long-standing players. This is their team. This is their locker room. They are, definitely the faces of the franchise at this point, them and Juuse Saros. When Nashville Predators, they had the whole Vegas U2 fiasco a couple weeks ago. They were absolutely embarrassed by the Dallas Stars. Things were not looking good. It looked like the Predators were going to go into complete fire sale mode. In comes the two leaders of the team. And I think this is important that it's these two players that stepped up and are now helping the Nashville Predators pace their way to 11 straight games with a point. Since that Dallas loss / the whole Vegas U2 thing being canceled, Filip Forsberg, 13 points in 7 goals. Remember, this was 3 weeks ago. Roman Yosi, 14 points since that Vegas situation, and was the NHL's first star of the week. Not only are they stepping up and carrying the load themselves, getting this team back on the right back, but they're really showing great leadership, I think. The way they're playing, the way they handled sort of, that embarrassing U2 fiasco. I'm not sure if it's more embarrassing to have the concert canceled or just the fact that reporters let it slip that you were even going to a U2 concert to begin with. Whatever it was, the way they handled it and the way they have sort of led the locker room and led by example on the ice is a big thing for the Nashville Predators. And those two guys are each playing hot. We know Filip Forsberg had a hat trick last week. Roman Yosi, absolutely on fire right now. Remember, we were talking about his scoring earlier this season, not necessarily being where it had been in years past. That certainly has changed. And he is on a roll right now. So those two players are the two players you absolutely needed to step up if you're the Nashville Predators, and they have, and you absolutely love to see it. We do have some minuses to get to, a couple more pluses, and yeah, we will end our show with that. First, though, I want to mention today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive in your garage. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right. It is our Tuesday edition of a plus minus. We are continuing on with a minus. And we talked about some stuff from the trade deadline. Here is something that absolutely did not work out for the Nashville Predators, and that is the Tyson Barry situation. Now, oh man, I cannot believe this man is still a Nashville Predator right now. To be fair, remember Barry Trotz didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Tyson Barry and Tyson Barry's agent at the beginning of this year. But to be fair, Barry Trotz did go out of his way to praise Tyson Barry and his agent after the deadline. Basically said, they did everything they could. They were working hard behind the scenes. They were trying to facilitate a trade. They really were working the phones, and for whatever reason, just didn't work out in Nashville. And it's also worth saying, and Barry Trotz made sure to mention this too, the players love him. He is a good locker room guy. By all accounts, this is a player that the players love. And this is a player who, according to, everyone you talk to, is bringing good energy into locker rooms and is being a positive influence. So it's not like he's, a locker room cancer or anything like that. But that being said, boy, this is a guy who hasn't played in almost a full month at this point. His last game was at awful Dallas Stars loss, the 9-2 game. He was a -3 in that game, a couple of bad turnovers, and hasn't seen the ice since. Just whenever the Predators put him on the ice, just to try to, get his trade value up, get his skates under him, let him show off a little bit, it's just absolutely backfired. I really thought the Nashville Predators maybe were going to put him on waivers, maybe like a buyout or something, let him go to the open market. I thought there was going to be maybe a team a team willing to maybe just give a 5th round pick or something just to get him off the Nashville Predators roster, maybe give him a chance to be on a Stanley Cup team. And boy, just his play combined with the trade market this year, the cards weren't there for him this year. And that sucks because, you hear about Tyson Barry. We know he's a good guy. Really wish that he, could have gotten this situation taken care of heading into the playoffs. But he's still a Nashville Predator as of now. So it's going to be interesting to see the role he plays for this team moving forward, because it doesn't seem like the Predators really trust him to do much on the ice. And it really seems like they're chomping at the bit to find some way to get Spencer Stastny up to the NHL full time. So it sounds like we'll have to wait to the off season to get Barry off the books. Let's move to something a little bit more positive, and that is another plus, and that is Luke Evangelista. This guy is hitting his stride at the absolutely right time. Goals in 3 straight games, points in 5 of his last 6. He also made a big play in the game tying goal against Minnesota this past game, the one that sent it into overtime. That awesome Tomas Holmstrom, Victor Arvidsson sort of jump screen in front of the net. That's a vintage play we haven't seen since like the mid 2010s. I love that style of hockey. You can start to see Luke Evangelista getting a little bit more responsibility from the coaches as the season goes on. He's up to 31 points this season. Remember, he had some healthy scratches a little bit earlier in the year just to kind of get his head right. He played, but now he's, a regular in the lineup, and he's one of the first guys off the bench. 17 minutes against the Minnesota Wild. That is, probably, among forwards, the second most behind that top line that the Nashville Predators rolled out. So not only are they giving him ice time, but they're giving him ice time in key minutes, in key games, and, in key situations too. So you're starting to see the trust get there for Luke Evangelista. And that's a big thing if you're a Nashville Predators fan, because look what's happened to Cody Glass as this season's gone on. Look what happened to Phil Tomasino. Look what happened to Juuso Parssinen. For all the talk maybe about the Predators, treating some of their players with kid gloves, look, all of a sudden you have a guy like Luke Evangelista stepping up, playing how the coaches want them to, and making a big payoff for his team in that regard. So kudos to Luke Evangelista. Excited to see what he can do moving forward. Another minus. Got to shout this out real quick. And this is a weird one. The Milwaukee Admirals. Remember that epic winning streak they had a couple of weeks ago? It was all the talk in the AHL. It became all the talk in Nashville sports media. We had people just tuning into AHL TV every week to try to see the Milwaukee Admirals continue the streak. Well, since that winning streak ended, they've lost 5 out of 6, including an ugly loss against Chicago the other night, 7-4. Yeah, this is a team that is struggling a little bit, which is rare because, look, they were one of the best teams in the AHL a couple of weeks ago. We've seen this a lot in terms of, we've seen it a lot on the NHL level. We see it in other sports, that big team, a team will just go on an insane run. this wild winning streak, whether it's a home winning streak or away winning streak or just total winning streak, go on this epic run. And then, the streak ends and boom, all of a sudden, the momentum's gone. And all of a sudden, now you have a losing streak. Now, all of a sudden, instead of winning all these games in a row, you're struggling to get momentum back. It doesn't even matter how that one loss happened. It could be a close game in overtime. You could have gotten blown out. It doesn't matter. Just something about that one loss just kind of gets teams into a tailspin sometime. And I think the Milwaukee Admirals have a really good team. They're one of the best teams in the AHL this year. So they just need to play their way out of it. And they have a lot of guys playing really well right now. We know they've had some roster turnover because Dennis Gurianov got traded. Jankowski's been up and down. So there's just, they're dealing with some roster issues too. They'll get it turned around. They just need to play their way out of it. But yeah, it's just been a little bit of a surprise to see the Admirals on a bit of a slide. In the spirit of my coworker, Ann Kimmel, we can't end on a minus. So let's end on a plus that might actually be a minus to some of you guys. And now I'm going to give a plus to John Hines. Okay, maybe this is a minus for Preds fans. We talked about this yesterday. John Hines, as coach of the Minnesota Wild, in overtime, pulled the goalie against the Nashville Predators. Made it a 4-on-3 with an extra attacker in overtime. This wasn't a penalty, and this also wasn't like the last 10 seconds of the game either. This was like 2-3 minutes left in the game, and it paid off. Matt Boldy scored the game-winning goal. We found out afterwards in a rule that not a lot of people knew, but kudos to Michael Russo from Minnesota and Alex Doherty for pointing it out here. If the Preds had scored on that empty net and the Preds win the game, Minnesota doesn't get a point. They don't even get the loser point because of an obscure NHL rule about pulling the goalie in overtime. And after the game, somebody asked John Hines, why'd you risk it? He said, 0 points, 1 point wouldn't have made a difference. We needed 2 points. And so that's why we win it. It was one of the ballsiest coaching moves I've ever seen in the NHL, and it paid off. And of course it was John Hines, and of course it was against the Nashville Predators. But I will say absolute kudos to John Hines for pulling that off. Really respect it. And yeah, good to see him making moves in Minnesota right now. Just wish it wasn't against the Nashville Predators. Let us know your pluses and minuses from the week. Tweet us at LO_Predators or leave a comment on our YouTube page. You can read my work every week on penaltyboxradio.com or find me on social media at _NSMorgan. That's going to do it for us on today's Locked On Predators podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day. Back with an all-new episode tomorrow. We'll see you then.